Hello, everyone. Welcome to MJ Hobby Corner. Martin here, and I would like to talk a little bit, give a little bit of an update on these mesh armies. As I said in previous videos, mesh armies are making a big comeback in 2025. I'll be working on a lot of these projects, and we're starting with medieval fantasy and then working our way up to other kinds of builds like sci-fi, starship builds, vehicle builds. All of those things will come later. And I'm even working on a technique for building Navy ships out of this mesh. Very, very small scale Navy ships. So, what I want to do is just give us an update on this first army. We're going to pull this unit back. This is an older unit. I made these. These are actually supposed to be like goatmen or beastmen or something like that, right? We can see the little horns on them. This is a very old unit now, and it was built when I was doing a lot of experimentation with mesh armies. This is not the first time I've built them. For those of you that have been with the channel for a long time, you know that I started these like a year back, and I worked on them for a good amount of time, and I built myself a whole pike and shot fantasy army. So like orcs with muskets, and that kind of stuff. So now I decided to go back and I want to build myself at least two or three fantasy armies, and they'll be in 6 millimeter, which is what this mesh gives you, roughly 6 millimeters, because it's not exact. Now, I've been experimenting with larger figures as well. Okay, and this is more 15 millimeter. This is horse and rider, and use hot glue for all the horses, regardless of the scale. Hot glue fills in the body a little bit, all right? And then I have the rider there, and he has his lance. So you can build in larger scales as well. But I already have 15 millimeter. I have a lot of 15 millimeter figures in my collection, and so I don't really need 15 millimeter any more 15 millimeter figures. I'm more interested in the 6 millimeter scale. So let's look at some of these, and I'll talk about some of the new techniques that I'm employing this year. So this is the sort of peasant unit, peasant spears, if you will. They're tightly packed, light infantry. And one of the most important things that I want to say about this is that um, in order to make mesh armies, painting is crucial because a lot of the details, these figures are so small. You're going to be working so small that I do consider this an advanced craft. Um, Painting is going to be adding details like facial details. You need your paint, all right? So using a brush, I use only cheap brushes. I can't afford expensive brushes, and I am not a master painter in any way, shape, or form. So I use a spotter brush from the company Plaid. I got these at Walmart, but I really take care of my brushes, and uh, I follow all the guidelines. Like, for example, when you're storing your brush, you never store it this way. You always want to store it this way. And for those of you that are painters, please forgive me. I'm not trying to lecture or anything like that. You guys already know this. But for anyone starting, painting is going to be critical. And that's because you I use the three-dimensional details that I glue, like the weapons, but you don't want to drive yourself bananas trying to add all of these tiny details. So instead, you use paint. And in this case, I used red paint for the little headgear that we see on these guys, and a little bit of skin tone. It's a little dot with the brush for the face. There's also little dots on the little spears for hands. So that's going to be a very important thing, is uh, knowing what details you can just skip and just do what you're painting, right? It's going to save a lot of time. It really saves a lot of time because I'm not driving myself bananas trying to put all these little details on. Okay. The other important thing about mesh armies that I want to say is we're working with stick figures. Okay. So that's it. These are stick figures. The horses, I look at them as glorified stick figures. We're working with the stick figure concept. And when we look at our grid, the most important thing is looking at the grid and learning the different shapes that we'll need for these stick figures. So for example, to do a humanoid shape, which is the easiest one, we use this cross shape here, right? And then to make the bottom part a little longer, the legs, we can make various cuts to make the legs either longer or shorter. If I want to represent dwarves or goblins, I can probably cut them here, right here where I'm pointing at. Let me give you guys a little more. I'm sorry. Right here. I can cut it here, and that's going to give me a shorter figure. And for a longer humanoid figure, I can cut it down here. And that discrepancy is enough to, say, represent figures like dwarves and, goblins and things like that. But we're working with stick figures, so we have to be realistic with that. These are not perfect. These are little stick figures. Now, for the archers, I am using a whole new technique this year. And what I'm doing is, and by the way, notice that there are short bows in the front, long bows in the rear. And one of the things that I'm doing is that I'm actually cutting the bows with the humanoid figure. So the bows are a little thicker. They're not to scale to the figure. And that is a technique that I am basing on actual figures in this scale. If you look at a lot of the pewter figures representing this scale, you'll note that a lot of the weapons are, well, they're a lot thicker than normal, right? The scale of the weapon is exaggerated. And there are reasons for that. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that if you try to make more like thinner weapons that are more in scale with the figure, it's going to break off. This scale is just way too small, right? So it is common practice to actually exaggerate the thickness of some of the weapons. So I decided, instead of using my typical thing, which I'll show in a minute, to make weapons and making the bows separate, which again is going to drive me bananas, I'd rather just figure out a way to cut the bows with attached to the stick figures that I cut, okay? And I have the template already. Even as I'm looking at this little box mesh here, I can already picture the bowman, okay? So here is, looking at this figure, here is the bow right here. Here is the bow. And then here is the man stick figure. So cutting that is going to give me a bowman, but I also have to trim the bows so that they're not so thick, all right? And I use the X-Acto blade for that. And I also use my scissors. So now that I've said that, so those are my two cutting tools, and both of those tools are actually important. The X-Acto knife is going to be extremely important for cutting details. And the scissors give you a nice cut for, like, if you're cutting multiple figures, okay? And then we're going to need pliers. I use these bent pliers to manipulate the bases. I also use needle nose pliers. This is a new tool this year. And one of the things that I want to point out, like with these bowmen, I'm trying not to show too much of my fingers. I mean, fingers get dirty in crafts, and, it kind of bothers some people. And I get it. I mean, I get it. I don't want to show like dirty fingers while I'm filming. So I use these thin needle nose pliers to put a very small amount of pressure on the bows. And what that does is that it elongates the bow. It makes the bow a little bit longer. And any discrepancy in length, for example, if the short part of the bow is a little shorter than the top part. By using these needle nose pliers and putting a little bit of pressure carefully on the bottom of the bow, they actually even out, because as you put pressure on the plastic, it gets longer. Okay, so that's a little trick that I'm using, and that little trick works for the riders on the horses as well as for the bowmen. Okay, so with the riders, I take my needle nose pliers and I put pressure right there on the waist. Here, I'm sorry, guys. I put pressure on the waist of the rider a little bit with the needle nose pliers. And this way I don't have to add heat or anything that like that. I can just position the figure the way I want it, because the pressure it kind of bends the plastic to the way I want it. Okay. Now, this is the warlord of, or general of, the army. And notice the horse is up on two legs. The general has a raised horse, and then his flagman, his bannerman, right there. And I do have to paint some details on the flags. The shields, someone asked me about that. So let me show you what the shields are. So here are the sequin packs that I'm using for shields, and you get these at Walmart in the craft section. And they're not very expensive, and you get a ton of these things, and these are the red ones that I'm using. Unfortunately, they are a little bit big in scale, okay? So they're a little bit big. Um, for the heavy infantrymen that have the shields, I use these little beads, seed beads. I'll show those in just a minute. And a little bit of hot glue, and then put the bead on there, and that represents the helmets. So it represents a heavily armed figure, armored figure. So perfect for heavy infantry. Again, the shields are a little bit big, but that's okay. I can deal with it right now. And if I want to make, the cool thing about sequins, if I want to take my time and make like rectangular tower shields, I can. It's going to take a little longer to cut the shapes that I want out of the sequin, but it does work. I've done it before, and so I can change the shapes of the shields. Um, these remind me of like the Greek shields, those big round shields. Um, but you can cut them to represent like half moon shields. So this way, if I want to do heavy infantry of different factions, I can differentiate, the little shields. It's just going to take me a little more time to make. So let me show you those glass beads. So here are the glass beads, and you get a ton of these. I paid like $10 for this at Walmart, and I've had this for months and haven't even made a dent in it. And I use these a lot for different scratch building details, especially like miniature uh, builds and stuff. So those are the little beads that I'm using to represent the helmets to these figures, okay? And it works really well. And again, we have to remember that we're playing with stick figures here. So learning how to cut the different the mesh into different shapes is going to be crucial to make all the different figures. Okay, I am currently working on, from this horse template, I'm working on making centaurs. And it's very easy to make the centaurs because the human figure that we see here, well, I shouldn't say easy, because none of this is really easy. But there's a good way of making centaurs by simply, instead of uh, cutting the horse and rider the way I do here, instead of cutting the head of the horse, I actually cut a humanoid shape like I did here with the rider. The rider is attached to the horse. It's not glued separately. It's part of the horse. It's just the way you cut the mesh to get both shapes in. So the centaur, instead of the head, will have the humanoid in front, and then you add whatever weapons you want to the centaurs. Down here, for the enemy army, once I finish painting these guys, I think I'm going to do lizardmen. I'm ready to tackle lizardmen. So we're going to look into making lizardmen and see how that works out. I may not be able to do the lizardmen all in one cut, the way I do with some of these, So it might be like lizardmen into separate parts. So I might have the tails separately. I don't know. We'll see. We'll work on it and see what technique I can come up with that is easiest. And last but not least, for the weapons, what I'm using is these acrylic broom filaments. Okay, these are broom filaments. It was an old broom, and I cut up the nasty parts of the filament, and just used the clean parts. And this is what I'm using this year for weapons. They work a lot better than the wire, I think, and they're great for making like these spears and muskets and any other weapon like that. And I'm actually preferring them over the wire. They glue a lot better. I'm using hot glue. That is my primary glue, and I'm also using like super glue, and sometimes I will mix super glue with white tacky glue. It gives me a very strong bond, and I was doing that with the weapons, but I'm finding that the hot glue is sufficient in most cases. When working with the hot glue in such a small scale, need to it helps if you have a hot glue gun with a smaller tip, a very thin tip. Mine broke off, unfortunately, because the gun fell by accident and the tip broke off. So I don't have the fine tip anymore. I'm going to have to get another glue gun. But I'm still working with this. And the idea is you have to really work on giving enough pressure on the trigger that you're making tiny, tiny beads of glue. And again, that just with practice that comes. And I think the more I do it, the better I get with that. And so this way you're not putting excess hot glue, which then makes the figure look kind of crappy. The actual tutorials on how to cut all these things will be in Scratch Builder Monthly, and that really helps the channel. It really helps me. It's my monthly magazine. For those of you guys that don't know, all of the tutorials will be there, and I take tons of pictures when I do these crafts. Okay. All right, everyone. Well, thank you to everyone here on YouTube for your support. Welcome new subscribers to the channel. And I will have more updates like this as I finish the different armies, some tips, things like that. Also, check out the shorts, as sometimes I will post little short updates as well. All right, have a great one. Be very safe, and we will talk soon.